In this unit, we'll be exploring two of the more prominent poleis, Sparta and Athens, and take a look at the development of each. And we should note that these two poleis will be, depending on which phase of Greek history we're looking at, they will be allies or they will be adversaries. It will take the Spartans first in this lecture and follow up with a look at the development of Athens in a subsequent lecture. But I should point out, using the map on this particular slide, that the reason these poleis, Sparta and Athens, are singled out for special treatment is in part because of the vast territory each will control. You will see here that Sparta is located on the Peloponnese Peninsula, and Sparta, through the course of much of its history, will wind up controlling a huge portion of this peninsula, which, as you can see, is a very, very large landmass. The Athenians will be located, Athens itself will be located on the Attic Peninsula. And over the course of its development, the Athenians will unify Attica, the Attic Peninsula, under their control. So both of these poleis will have significant resources in population, in land, and in other resources, and that will make them uh, sort of the top tier of Greek poleis. So we'll begin by looking at the early history of Sparta, and we'll take a look at some of the characteristics of its culture, its government, and why it basically took a turn toward extreme militarism as a means of organizing its society. So Sparta itself, the Spartans were believed to be descended from a group of people called the Dorians that inhabited the northern fringe of Greece. And when the catastrophe of the Bronze Age and the collapse of Mycenaean civilization occurred, the original inhabitants of the Mycenaean palaces are believed to have migrated eastward and moving into Attica and then beyond into that area, that fringe area of Ionia that is located on the coast of western Turkey today. So, with the original inhabitants leaving during the collapse of the Bronze Age Mycenaean period, these Dorians, which were considered a bit less civilized, a bit more primitive, if you will, they can now migrate downward and take control of the abandoned settlements and civilization of the Mycenaeans. And the early legend had it that this was an invasion, and some scholars believed up until the early 20th century that these Dorian peoples had been responsible for the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. That is not believed to be so today. It is believed that, just as I outlined it a moment ago, that the original inhabitants largely fled the chaos of a collapsing Mycenaean civilization, and that left vacant a lot of territory that the Dorians were then able to inhabit and exploit. Now, as I mentioned, the Spartans will, over the course of time, take control of much of the Peloponnese, and that is because while many Greek poleis throughout Greece during the Archaic period will choose overseas colonization as a means of dealing with population pressures, the Spartans will instead decide that they will go ahead and invade their neighbors on the Peloponnese and take control of their territory and basically subject their fellow Greeks, these neighboring peoples, to a type of servitude status, forcing these peoples who were known as the Messenians to become Spartan serfs. And the Spartans will actually coin a term called the helots to describe these people who have been basically forced into bondage. So that gives us some of the early background. Let's proceed a little further. Now, here is Sparta, located basically towards the center of the Peloponnese Peninsula, and as I mentioned, the Spartans will not be big fans of overseas colonization. They will have one colony in Italy, what is now Tarentum, what the Spartans refer to as Taros. But that colony will be established in the roughly about 710. And that will be just about the only colony attributed to the Spartans, because in the 700s, the 700s BC, the Spartans will again embark on this long-term conquest of their neighbors, the Messenians. And by the end of the 7th century BCE, the Spartans will have made huge inroads into the conquest of Messenia. Now, as you can see here from the red text, these Messenians will not go peacefully or not go quietly into bondage, and there will be some very significant revolts that will very much test the Spartan ability to control a hostile population. But by the 650s, it is believed that the Spartans have more or less conquered Messenia and have indeed forced the native population, the Messenians, into servitude. And this is where we'll get the references to the Helots as being serfs of the Spartans, serving the Spartan state. Now, this is going to be a pivotal moment in Spartan history, because the constant tension between the Spartan overseers and the Messenian Helots is going to force Sparta to embark on this process of extreme militarization that will forever define the Spartans in the historical imagination. Now, the lawgiver who is credited for creating the most militaristic constitution in history, is a guy named Lycurgus. And it is doubtful whether Lycurgus was actually a real person. He was, again, instead one of these sages, these mythical lawgivers, whose wisdom and organizational ability was able to establish for the Spartans what is called eunomia, and that is kind of the well-governed state. And in the well-governed state, when you have a case of eunomia, you're not necessarily concerned with people's rights. And this makes sense when we look at Sparta, because of course the Helots are in bondage, but the Spartans also were in a way enslaved. They were slaves to their law. And this is one of the later Spartan kings will make this statement during the Persian War period, that the Spartans are slaves to the law. And they certainly were, when you consider how rigorous a legal requirement, a legal burden was placed on the Spartans from the moment that they were born. And again, many of you are probably familiar enough with some of the more extreme stories related to the Spartan civilization to know that newborns were examined shortly after birth to determine physically if they were strong enough to endure the rigors of the Spartan society. And those newborns who were considered too weak were exposed to left to die outside. Now, infant exposure was not unique to Sparta. Other Greek states practice it, but it was usually a decision made by the parents, not necessarily a decision made by the state. And that really does set Sparta aside from the other Greek polis and how they did things. You would have a Spartan official visit your home and examine the baby, and it was the decision of that Spartan official whether the child would live or die. So that's a key difference. And of course, the child, if it was allowed to live, would live at home with the mother for till the age of 7, and then again, the Spartan officials would mandate that at 7, the child's taken from his mother and would begin a lifelong process of militarization, military training, physical fitness, and generally a constant process of testing, physically and psychologically testing, that would basically be the condition for the Spartan male for the rest of his life. And of course, this process would be formalized up until about the age of 30, when the Spartan male, had he performed well enough, would be voted into one of these subunits called Sicilian. These are mess units where a group of men would be billeted together, they would eat together, and it was the responsibility of the members of one of these mess units, these Sicilia, to decide whether or not to vote a young Spartan into full Spartan status. And if indeed the young Spartan man was voted in by his peers, he would become known as a peer himself, a homoioi, or equal. And it was not unusual for Spartans to undergo decades of this brutal training, only to be voted down because of some perceived flaw. And again, we might imagine this was a shattering rejection. But from the Spartan perspective, it was absolutely necessary that only the best would be made full Spartan warriors, or homoioi, and that is because of the constant fear of a Helot revolt. And even though the last major revolt of the Helots was crushed in the 6th century, there would be subsequent revolts in, for example, 464. So the Helots were a constant threat, and in a way, the Spartans are enslaved by the Helots because they live in constant fear, and they've organized themselves in such an extreme militaristic lifestyle that there was very little room for any type of freedom or any type of cultural opportunity other than to train to be a warrior. And we might imagine that in a way it takes quite a toll on the Spartans. But they made this choice, and they felt it was necessary, and they will live by this code, this Lycurgan constitution, for centuries. And it certainly will set the Spartans aside from the other Greeks, and it will give the Spartans a notorious reputation for military efficiency, but also a type of brutality. And the brutality comes into play as one of the final initiations that were undergone by young Spartan men who were finishing up the process of military boot camp, the agoge as it's called. The Spartan males, if they performed exceptionally well, would be enlisted into a type of secret society called the Crypteia. And it was the role of the Crypteia to instill constant fear into the Helots. So that would constantly keep the Helots off balance and unable to organize any type of serious revolt. And what would happen basically is these young Spartan males who were enlisted into the Crypteia would be given a knife and would be told to go out at night and roam the countryside looking for any Helots who were out and about. The Helots were under a curfew where they had to remain in their homes. And again, the Spartans did not want any gathering of Helots or any communication between the Helots when the Spartans were not able to oversee such communication. So to discourage it, this Crypteia and the young assassins would roam the countryside, and any Helot found outside of his house during the nighttime hours would be assassinated. And so again, there is this aspect of totalitarianism and brutality that is part of Spartan society, and it certainly does get overlooked in more popular treatments, such as the movie 300, which certainly showed the brutality of the agoge training system, but really did not highlight this servitude and bondage and brutality that the Helot population was forced to endure. Now, although it was a very rigorously organized society, ironically, women in Sparta were known to have more freedom than women in any other Greek polis. And this makes sense when you consider that Spartan males were often away either on campaign or on some sort of military duty, or even during times of relative peace. Spartan males spent most of their time with their messmates in the barracks. And so Spartan women were often on their own in managing the household in their husband's stead. So it was expected that women would be every bit as physically fit as males. Now, there was no real equivalent to the agoge for women, but the idea was, and again, we must always remember Spartans did practice a type of eugenics in the sense of trying to create a master race. So the idea was that strong, healthy women will give birth to strong, healthy children, particularly strong, healthy sons. And women were encouraged to have as many children as possible, particularly sons. And it is said that Spartan males, they would be honored after death if they were killed in battle. Well, Spartan women, if they died during childbirth, would have their names carved into a type of monument to commemorate their sacrifice for the state. And that, of course, is what childbirth was considered. It was a service to the state, and if you would die in the midst of this service, you would be commemorated as a woman for your sacrifice. So, women also Spartan women were notorious for their attire or lack thereof. It often shocked visitors from other polis who were visiting Sparta. The women would, as a type of hospitality ritual, welcome the visitor at a feast, and the women would perform a type of dance called the bibasis, and this would require them to jump up and down, slapping the backs of their heels to their buttocks, and this would go on and on and on for quite a long time, showcasing the endurance and the physical fitness of the Spartan women. But of course, when they did this dance, their skirts, which were rather short, would flash up, and of course, this would give the visitor who was witnessing this dance a glimpse of thigh, and therefore Spartan women become known throughout the Greek world as the thigh flashers. And this again was a type of scandalous statement as to the freedom that the Spartan women enjoyed. The freedom to manage estates, the freedom to shop in the markets unsupervised by males. Again, in other Greek polis, particularly in Athens, women were scrutinized and kept under close watch by male relatives, and they couldn't really appear out in public without a male supervision, a male chaperone. Not the case in Sparta, where again women are managing the household. They are put in charge of the daily chores and the daily work requirements of the helots. So a lot of responsibility placed on Spartan women for the day-to-day operations of the Spartan society. And I should point out in this examination of the components of Spartan society that was an intermediate group that did not enjoy the full rights and privileges of full Spartan citizens. The Spartiates, are the homoioi as they were called. Nor were they kept in captivity or bondage or forced servitude, as the helots were. This intermediate group were known as the periokoi, translated as the dwellers around, and this was a population made up of people who were, if the need arose, were able to be enlisted into the Spartan military ranks and would be able to fight alongside the Spartans. but their primary role was as freehold farmers or craftspeople. The Spartans themselves did not practice agriculture. They left that to the helots, nor did they practice commerce or any type of crafts or industry. And for military society, even in the ancient world, there was a requirement for someone to create weapons and shields and armor and all that stuff. And this role was filled by these periakoi, who had been likely, very likely early on when the Spartan Synoikism, the unification of those five original villages, there may have been these other populations who could prove useful, and the Spartans decided to give them limited rights and freedoms in return for their capabilities as craftspeople. So again, these are the three broad categories of Spartan society. Now let's take a look at the unique nature of Spartan government. Now, regarding Spartan government, the Spartans historically have been praised in many quarters for the stability of their constitution, and commentators, historical commentators, have noted that the Spartans create one of the earliest what is called a mixed or balanced constitution, because it contains elements of the three main types of political system. You have a monarchical component representing monarchy. You have an oligarchic component representing a kind of an aristocracy, oligarchy. And you have a democratic component representing the popular masses, all merging together in a kind of complex type of political machinery. Now, Sparta was technically considered a diarchy because the prominent offices were held by not one king but two. And this may reflect the earliest moment of Spartan political culture, when five original villages in the Peloponnese decided to unify, what was called a process of Synoikism. And the two prominent villages were, as a type of compromise, were granted leadership roles. And the headmen of these two villages are thought to have later bequeathed this dual monarchy. And we get two dynasties that are ruling side by side, the Aegeans and the Eurypontids. And as we might imagine, this did create friction at times. Sometimes the two kings who are serving alongside one another really didn't like one another and would do what they could to sabotage the other's policies. So this was it could have been a real stumbling block, but fortunately the kings were actually in a type of subordinate position to another group of officials. And these are the five A4s, who actually had oversight and could impeach the kings for various misbehaviors. Now, we note that five A4s, one for each of the five original villages that comprise the first of the Spartan population. So the kings are actually in a very limited role. They led the army when it was out on campaign. One king would go with the army, the other king would stay back in Sparta. That is a later development. And the kings also are responsible for overseeing the religious rituals, as their type of priestly officials also. So we have the two kings, we have the five A4s, and then we have a type of what I would call a bicameral legislature. And of course, bicameral is a term we're familiar with today because in the United States, our Congress, our legislature, is divided into two houses, where we have the Senate, which is considered the more prestigious of the houses, and the House of Representatives. And the Spartans will pioneer this type of bicameral process by instituting what is known as a kind of a higher council, the Gerousia, which is a council made up of 28 men who are 60 years or older, and the two kings. And of course, in the ancient period, the older you were, the more it was thought that you had imbibed enough wisdom through your years that you could be a type of wise man. And so the Gerousia is made up of 28 men who are 60 years or older, and they are chosen out of the popular assembly. And the popular assembly was made up of all Spartan homoioi, those who had made it through the rigorous aggregate process and were well on their way to being voted into the mess, the Sisudion, by their peers. So all Spartiates, all full Spartiates will make up the assembly, and from the assembly, you're in it for life. Unless somehow you do something terrible and you're banished from Sparta, you're in for life. And if you manage to reach the age of 60, you could be voted into this Gerousia should a vacancy occur. Should one of the older members die of natural causes and they need a replacement, that replacement will come from the broader assembly. Now, the Gerousia would be responsible for initiating legislation. They are the ones, remember these are 28 of the elders plus the two kings, they come up with the laws that will be later voted on in an up or down yes or no vote by the assembly. Now, the Gerousia also retains the right of veto. So it also had the power to veto any law that they did not believe should move forward, even if it had been voted ahead by the General Assembly. So again, we see this kind of checks and balances that are built into the Spartan system, the different branches of government, and the important oversight functions. First, the A4s overseeing the kings, and then the Gerousia having a type of oversight ability over the broader assembly made up of largely of younger Spartans. Now, these branches of government were important because we must always remember that the Spartans were deathly afraid of reigniting a Helot revolt. So you had to have various entities looking at foreign policy decisions in particular to determine whether or not an issue was important enough where the Spartans were willing to commit military forces. And to commit a military force was a big risk. Not only, the idea that, you could actually lose in battle, although that was very rare for the Spartans, but the idea is that if you are draining manpower, military manpower, away from Sparta itself, that could give the Helots an opportunity to rise up and revolt. And the assembly made up of the homoioi. The homoioi, being the younger men, would by far be the more willing to take chances outside of Sparta and perhaps gain for themselves military glory in far-off campaigns. It was the role of the elders, the Gerousia, to temper that enthusiasm when it came to foreign policy by being ever mindful that the Helots were in many ways the most dangerous threat that any Spartan could ever face.